So today, we're going to be talking about the interrelations of FrameNet and cognitive science more generally. Before we get very far, so the outline is I'm going to give you the introduction to CogSci, kind of Berkeley style introduction. Going to say how cognitive linguistics informs FrameNet, and then going to speculate about how cognitive linguistics is informed by FrameNet. And I have some particular areas for that. I'm going to apologize in advance. The slides are very sketchy today because I haven't been able to properly sleep in several days, and I'm a completely auditory person, so I will have no trouble lecturing, but for all of you out there who are visual people, I apologize. I'm going to put more material on the slides after the lecture so that when you download it later, if you're a visual person, you'll be able to see the stuff I talk about there. Also, plagued by other technical difficulties, and so the readings aren't up either. So lots of technical difficulties on my end, including both software and what we call in English wetware. So it's going to be interesting. One thing I want from you guys is to pick a frame that you understand. There should be at least one at this point. You should understand at least one frame. And how would you augment its description to make it more in line with what we know about the mind? How would you make it more explicitly connected with what we know about the human mind? Okay? I'm going to give you an example in here of what I mean by that. And other than the explicitly labeled example, there's going to be lots of implicit examples as well. So listen up, listen in, and when you're done with the lecture today, by tomorrow, I would love to have some idea about this. Okay. So basics of CogSci. So I'm sure all of you know this, but I'm going to run through it quickly. The whole idea behind cognitive science is to emphasize the connection between any field that has something to say about the mind. This is not a complete list, not at all. For example, mathematics is in here. There are people doing cognitive physiology. I mean, really, almost anything can be cognitive. But these fields are the ones which are sort of the core cognitive fields. And as you see, artificial intelligence is sort of an early member of this set. Philosophy is obvious. Anthropology, psychology, neurology. Neurology has been getting increasingly important because we're actually starting to know something about how the brain is connected together and how this might actually be able to explain something about our experience of thinking, which is certainly one of the most important aspects of cognitive science. Also, linguistics. And one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that really any of these fields can give data to the others, can constrain the theory of the others, because we're all making a joint theory of the mind. First of all, I want to point out that even though in the field we have a distinction between cognitive linguists and non-cognitive linguists, according to my extremely biased perspective, all linguists are cognitive scientists. And yes, I do mean even phoneticians, because all of linguistics is about categories. We don't do anything without categories in linguistics. And in fact, the few places where categories are less relevant, such as iconicity, we have very little to say about them in linguistics, and we usually say that's the job of people who do semiotics. So, in general, we are studying human behavior as generated by human categories. We're more specific than that, right? I mean, we're studying human behavior that's intended to be meaningful, but the intent to be meaningful is totally based on the categories that the speaker, the communicator has, and the categories that they assume that the addressee has. It's inherently interdisciplinary. So earlier than many of the other parts of cognitive science, linguistics knew that it had to worry about culture. Linguistics knew that it had to worry about aspects of psychology, and that would affect how people would speak. And so cognitive science is a deep, old, and I would say should be pervasive part of linguistic science. Also, in linguistics, we're dealing with the data where categories are most evident. So if you're an anthropologist and you are watching a ceremony, until you hear people from that culture describe the ceremony in words, it can be very hard for you to figure out what the actual categories are. You can impose categories, you can make inferences, and in fact, when anthropologists are studying ancient cultures that we only have physical remains from, that's all they can do. So, in the case of anthropology, we can infer that because these people are humans, that they must have been thinking in categorical terms, and the various products that they have from their culture must in some way be entangled with their categories, but it's very hard to know. Whereas with linguistics, the main thing that language does is it takes the world and it imposes category labels on it. And so the most direct evidence we have about categories comes from our field. So, I'm going to say that at the highest level, these are the things that we should keep in mind that have been found from a large number of different perspectives. So all of those different fields that I was talking about before have something to say about the following. Conscious thought rests on a sea of unconscious thought. So what we are aware of and what we can talk about is conscious thought. But we all know that you can talk while driving. And in fact, while driving, you can process the fact that something is a stop sign and appropriately stop, even while in the middle of a conversation. So, you know, that's all, and you might not even really be aware of the fact that you did that, right? You're mostly probably, when you're in a conversation, aware of the conversation. You may, hopefully, be aware of the road as well, but most of the job is going to be taken care of by unconscious processing. That's also true with language. So we're aware of things that we say to some degree, but are you actually even aware of which words you're going to speak before you say them? I don't think anybody can be, right? I mean, the same mental, cognitive brain real estate that you use in order to do the speaking is the cognitive real estate that you would use in order to think about the nature of what you are saying. That's one of the reasons why linguistics is really hard, because in order to form categories about categories, well, then we have to use the same structure twice. And it's well known from psychological results that that is always hard. The particular nature of our human mind matters. So I haven't put this in the most controversial terms. The most controversial terms, which are promoted by people from Berkeley, are the terms of embodiment. So the strongest way to say this is that it doesn't make any sense to study the human mind at all without thinking about the particulars, the details of the human body. The fact that when we're angry, we get warmer, and things of that nature. So not everybody buys that. There's what you can call sort of the neo-cognitivist movement, which came before the embodied cognitivist movement. And neo-cognitivists, which are very prominent still to this day, will probably grant this weaker form, but they won't grant the stronger form. So the weaker form is just, there are real details of the human mind. And those details don't come down to things that would have to be true of anything that can do some form of semantic processing. We are much more specific than general semantic processors. Okay? I'm also giving a weaker form of the last insight, which is, as I say, most abstractions are metaphorical. So there's a strong form of this that says all abstraction is metaphorical, so that all of math, all of words like democracy or freedom and all these things, that every one of these is metaphorical. I'm following Rafael Núñez in hedging slightly. One of the reasons for that is because there are experimental results that show that if you have enough experience in an abstract domain, that you form a representation of it which is less entangled with your basic conception of your body moving through the world, perception, and all these really basic things that metaphors are generally based on. So, for example, just to, Rafael Núñez does work on mathematics, and the kinds of cases that he's talking about are when mathematicians deal with calculus, they don't always have to go all the way back to their physical, spatial understanding in order to do some work. There are cognitive shortcuts, and some of those cognitive shortcuts may have nothing to do with that other stuff. It's something that people are doing research on. Okay, actually I'm going to skip this for a moment. Really important aspect of the development of cognitive science that's really going to make a difference for FrameNet. There's a progression of research that shows that human categories are not classical. So classical categories are those that can be expressed with necessary and sufficient conditions. So, for example, if I want to define a chair, a necessary condition, I think we could all agree, is that you can sit in it, at least in theory. Sufficient conditions are kind of harder, because it's not absolutely everything that you can sit on that counts as a chair. But let's just say that necessary conditions might, sufficient conditions might be things like is a physical object. That's in the necessary conditions. That sufficient conditions would be things like how many legs it has, or it contacting the floor, things like that. Because there are other things that we can sit on that don't contact the floor in the same way, and then they might not be categorized as chairs. You can see that categories, since that's what we're describing with frames, are really, really important for FrameNet. So this particular thread of cognitive science, the development of the study of categories, is what I'm going to focus on most in what we're talking about. Nature of mind is super important, And that's what a huge chunk of the research is about. And I do think that linguistics has something to say about that, but it's less central to what we are doing in FrameNet. So, one of the things that really got the ball rolling is the study of color categories. So there was a study by Berlin and Kay in 1969. They had this idea of basic color categories, which they defined really this way. So they should be words that have, or roots that have only one meaningful piece. The categories should not be subcases of any other category. They should apply to any object, and they should be salient somehow. So they went out and they did a survey of 20 different languages from several different language groups. The Bay Area is great for this kind of thing because people from all over the world live there. They really did not have to go anywhere else to do these 20 languages from, I think, 5 different major language groups. It was pretty easy to do as far as that goes, and it's still easy to do today, although people usually don't. So they found was that all of the languages that they surveyed had some way of representing black and white categorically. If they had more colors, then they would have red. If they had more colors than that, they would have green or yellow. And if they had 5, then they would have these 5, black, white, red, green, yellow, and so on. So that eventually you get all the way to gray, which is in the same general category with purple, pink, orange. Later research also found that there is a category that doesn't exist in English. This category, the name I'm giving to it comes from Russian, goluboy. And this is a category that differentiates between dark blue and light blue. And there are a few languages that have this, but all of them have all of the other ones. Notice that this complete list of 10 here is the complete list of basic colors in English. And probably most of the Western European languages, which are peculiar in this way. I'm going to ignore the part of the study that has to do with history and how languages develop because it's actually irrelevant for what we're talking about today. One thing that's really important is that regardless of the number of categories, there was a focal color in each case. It's the best exemplar, the one that most of the participants would choose. If you said, well, which of these is the best example of red? And they will choose a particular one most of the time. So this says that this already is making the sort of classical theory of categories a little bit shaky. Because if every color which is classified as red, for example, is equally red, right? I mean, there's no gradability to a classical theory. Things are red or they are not red. And if that were true, then people should be randomly choosing. Because they're all red, so I'll just pick whichever one, whatever. But that's not what people did. So this was already evidence that the classical theory is a little shaky. Well, another thing to note, which is important for universalism, is that focal colors are similar across languages. They're not the same, and obviously, since we have a different number of categories, not all of the same foci will be there. Interestingly, there's some evidence, for example, that in cases where you have a green-blue word, that's a single word that covers green and blue, there's some evidence that suggests that the focal colors are near focal green and focal blue, depending on the language or the respondent. The data are very complex and contested. I'll give you one more thing from this direct line of research. There's Audrey Gilbert et al. in 2006 showed that these linguistic categories, whatever they are, actually affect non-linguistic perception. So this was a study in which you had a central object which was a particular color. And it was surrounded by little circles. Most of them would be gray, neutral color. One of the other things, which was located either on the left or on the right, would be either the same color or a different color as the central color chip. And the participant's task was to decide, is it the same or different? You show it very briefly, you just sort of flash it up on the screen, and then you ask them to say yes or no, same or different. What you can show is that the language that the participants speak actually matters, but only when the color that you're matching against appears in the right visual field. Note, and this is where I'm going to say that, all that other stuff that we were talking about matters, note that the right visual field is hooked up to the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere, we probably all know, is connected up with language, and I would say that this indicates is also connected up with non-linguistic categorical thought, which is partially formed by your linguistic categories. The specific results are that people were slower to respond about whether it's the same or different when the two color chips were were within category with each other. And were faster to respond when they were across a category boundary, even if the perceptual distance was the same. Okay? So this is really important stuff because this shows that we're not just doing language, we're also really studying cognition. The whole sequence of results are very widely debated. So there's a ton of articles specifically about color categorization and how that comes about. And there are lots of the aspects that are not clear. I mean, there's whether focal colors are really focal, and how the categories are constructed, what are the boundaries, all these things, lots of debate. Right now, there's a sort of intermediate universalist / relativist theory that seems to be reigning. I asked Paul Kay recently, what was the real deal, and he said, yeah, nobody has an extreme position anymore, basically. So, and this sort of repeats in any other domain that you could look at, many of which have been completely separately studied from color. So one thing that's really important is people have debated a lot of stuff about how many categories and how these categories get formed, but generally the one thing that they haven't contradicted is the complexity of the categories. This sometimes gets lost in the shuffle because people are so caught up in the debatable parts of the studies. But this part is not actually controversial anymore. The colors definitely show non-classical categories. And it initiated the drive for cognitive category theory, which was pushed forward a few years later with Eleanor Roche's 1975 study. So one thing that's important is that when she probed other things, so looking at things that weren't color, looking at furniture, or looking at birds, she found that category membership was gradable. So the same thing that we were talking about with colors, where some parts of the category were more solid than others, some parts of the category were better examples of the category than others. She found the same thing in other domains. You can see that this is actually the initial studies actually established a lot of what we can use to probe category theory psychologically. So, for one thing, response times for membership in the category differ for different members. So, if you give somebody the chance to say whether a chair is furniture or not, they will respond really fast, because a chair is really a prototypical piece of furniture. But if you ask them whether a lamp is furniture, then they'll take a little longer. And if you ask them whether a refrigerator is furniture, then they take even longer. Right? These are just not as good examples of the category. Everyone will agree that they're members, you know, if pressed, until you get to the very edge of the category. But the amount of time that it takes them to confirm their membership is longer. There's also variability in the degree of priming by the larger category word. So let's say that I'm trying to describe, so first I show somebody the word furniture. Okay? This is going to bring up in their mind everything that's connected with furniture. And again, you know, this isn't going to be at the conscious level. You know, they're not going to be listing items of furniture overtly in their mind, but still there's a level of activation that will occur for anything which fits the category. Then, if you flash a sentence up about chairs, and you ask, actually, not that this is what she did, but actually, if you ask any question about a chair, people will be faster to respond if you've given them the category furniture first. And if you compare this to how quickly people respond to a word like lamp, the amount of time to answer the question, whatever it is going to be more affected for chair than it is for lamp. Okay? So this gives you evidence that subconscious processing is activating the category of chair more than it's activating the category lamp. Yeah? Okay. So the last thing that's, that people always measure is the likelihood of being listed as a member of the category. So if you just say, okay, quick, give me 5 pieces of furniture, then people will totally give you bed, they will totally give you chair, they will give you couch. What would Thiago say? Table is an awesome example. But, you know, after a few examples, people don't list them. Oh, sorry. Here, thank you. And after a few examples like this, people don't tend to list them. They don't list them when they're just sort of asked to come up with members really quick. The same thing goes for birds. If you're asked to list birds, well, let's see. What kinds of birds do people think of? Do we have a microphone out there? Pass a microphone to somebody. Let's start over here. So can you name some birds?
Pardal é o primeiro que me vem à cabeça.
That comes to my mind. I don't know in English pardal, but this is the name in Portuguese.
Beija-flor.
Also, hummingbird.
Canarinho.
Canary.
Pomba.
Pigeon. Sparrow.
Sabiá.
I don't know another one. I don't know in English. Sabiá in Portuguese.
All right. Pass the microphone forward.
Eu já falei ali com ele.
I already said it's the
Okay. Now pass to somebody else, and I'm going to ask a different question. I'm going to ask a different question. So now can you think for a moment about what are the categories? What are the characteristics of the things that people just listed? So there were a bunch of birds that people talked about. What do they all have in common?
Podem voar.
They can fly. They can fly. They're small. Very small size. What else? They have wings. Beaks. Beaks.
Duas patas.
Two legs. Two coughs. Coughs.
Okay, so those are all good properties. Now, somebody tell me about a bird that doesn't have those properties. Can you pass the microphone? Okay. Oh, we have a volunteer. Good.
Maybe penguin.
Penguin is an excellent example of a bird that doesn't have those properties. I will point out that there's a reason why people didn't mention penguin first. It's because penguin is not a core member of the category. Okay? All right, so, all right, we're all on the same page about this. Then, after the studies on the radial nature of categories, Rosh wasn't content to finish studying categories yet, and so she then, in 1978, did a study on basic categories. So, basic categories, her study showed that there were sort of three kinds of categories that you could worry about. There are basic ones that are going to receive a real definition, the ones that people will think about if you just sort of ask them, you know, you just flash something up on the screen and you say, what was that? People are not going to say a Dalmatian dog. They're not going to say an animal. If they saw a dog, they're going to say dog. Even though they have a lot more information, right? I mean, let's say, a Dalmatian dog is very distinctive with white, with black spots, and most people know about the name of this, but it doesn't matter. There's sort of a natural answer to the question of what the category is. Now, this will change, of course, under other circumstances, but for out-of-the-blue questions and things like that, and default reasoning patterns, this is the natural level of categorization. Anything which is more general than that is a superordinate category. So animal, for example, is a superordinate category. And anything which is more specific than that is a subordinate category. So things like Dalmatian or puppy. So one thing that Rosh hypothesized is that the basic level category is the one that's most informative. The one that gives you the most idea of what you're supposed to do with this thing, whatever it is. So chair is a basic level category. Why is that? Well, because you can sit in it. It's pretty important. Furniture, you do lots of different stuff with. You know, you might sit in it, you might lie in it, you might put things on it so that you could eat. There's lots of different things you might do with furniture. And similarly, if you think about something like, if you compare a sofa to what we call in English a love seat. A love seat is much smaller. Usually only 2 people can sit there, which is why it is named that. But people are not usually going to name love seat as a separate category. They're going to say it's couch, or they're going to say it's a sofa, because both of those are names for the same thing depending on dialect in English. But the reason for that is because, you know, I mean, the important thing is you and somebody else can sit there, right? That's how a couch is different from a chair. And that is true regardless of whether it's a big couch or a small couch. That is related to the distinction, the categorical distinction between one and many, which we also independently have evidence for. Okay? So you can see that that same thing plays out for dogs and birds and bugs, which are basic. Dogs, you pet them. Birds, depending on your culture. I'll get into that in a moment. Birds, you just look at them and don't do much else with them. Bugs, you squish them and don't like them. So, you know, these things can be defined in terms of how you interact with them in the world. And so it's very useful if you just see something for just a moment to know how you should interact with it. That's the most useful piece of information. One thing to note is that these basic categories are not universal. So probably, if you grew up in a city, then tree is a basic level category for you. Because, you know, I mean, with trees, what do you do with them? You look at them or you climb them. That's probably it. If you grew up in the country, as I did, tree is not a basic level category. Because where I come from, some trees we would harvest from. So, for example, pecans and other nuts. Other trees we would tap for sugar. So maple trees, you can tap and get sugar from them. Other trees are good for firewood. Other trees are good to make furniture from. So for me, I have a difference between walnuts, pecans, cedar trees, which smell nice, hickory. You know, I have, all of these for me are basic level categories because I have a different functional understanding of them. Now, given that I've been in a very urban culture for a long time, if you just flashed a picture up in front of me of one of these trees, I still might just say it's a tree. But I might not. I've actually been an experimental subject in one of these, and my responses for biological things were so weird that they actually threw out my results for the whole thing. Because everybody else who was in college, where I was, in Berkeley, they had grown up in a city or a suburb, and so they didn't think of squirrels as things that you shoot and eat, for example. And so the fact that they're not just, you know, animals is quite different for me. Okay, I'm gonna, before we go into this, I'm actually gonna go into a few things that I don't have slides for, but I do have plenty to say about. And then we're going to take a short break. So the category stuff didn't end with Roche, right? In the 1970s, this really shook things up. It made people realize, oh, wait a minute, there is this other thing out there, cognitive categories. And of course, everybody understood that you know, the way that people categorize things is not the same as the way mathematicians or philosophers would do it. But up until the time of Rosh, it was just sort of thought of as wrong. So people would make errors of classification. So this is very much like the development in linguistics of the acknowledgement of the realities of language. So in older studies of language, if what somebody said wasn't the same as the standard grammar, then the only thing to say about it was that it was wrong. And of course, no modern linguist thinks that. I mean, they might also think it doesn't agree with the standard grammar, and we all have reactions to things which are barbarisms, in our opinion. But we also know scientifically that there's not really any, other than the social meaning, there's not any difference in the grammar that people use to speak to their friends and the kind of grammar that you would use to write an article in the journal language. So they're all grammars, and they all have rules, and none of them have all the rules specified written down anywhere. They're all just things we understand. The situation with categories is a little different from that, because there's a real fundamental difference between classical categories and these other things that had been considered just wrong. They actually don't work the same. The really important thing that Ross showed, and the reason why it was taken up by the scientific community, is that she showed that you can't just say that there is error in categorization and just leave it at that. There's actual structure there. There's some structure that just has nothing to do with the classical category theory. So what this means for us as linguists is that all of these things that we're relying on to do linguistic work, categories, are themselves not simple at all, and that we should always keep this in mind. It took a little while, not a huge long while, but it took a little while for these ideas to get anywhere outside of psychology. The stuff started to get into linguistics until eventually in the 80s, we ended up with George Lakoff's book, Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things. The whole enormous tome of it is dedicated to explaining how categories are not classical. And if you are doing anything with FrameNet, you need to know the ways in which non-classical categories are formed. There are some other things that come more recently out of this, including the work of Lara Boroditsky. By the way, I can kind of recommend anything she's ever written. She's kind of generally awesome. But she has also written about category entanglement, and here's how. So we all know that many languages, including the ones that you guys speak, have grammatical gender. The standard linguistic mythology is that it's completely grammatical. It's completely idiosyncratic, you have to memorize it for every word, and it's not semantic. Well, that's partially true, perhaps. But a study from Lara Boroditsky shows that there are problems with that view, simply considered. The study goes something like this. You take words that have different gender in different languages. So you need languages that have gender. So English is not even in this study at all. But German and French and Spanish, Italian, all of them have gender, and there are certain categories that they assign different gender to in the most commonly used word to express that category. One really salient example, at least it's always very salient for me, is, in Spanish, puente, el puente, the bridge. Well, it's masculine in Spanish, but in German, it's feminine. Die Brücke. And, okay, that is what it is. Now, what you do is for each participant in your study, some of them are Spanish speakers, some of them are German speakers, you give them a picture. And you ask them to describe the picture, however they want to. Just give some characteristics. So you show them a picture of a bridge. Now, what is it that you would imagine? So I'm going to ask you to predict, based on where I'm going, what descriptions would, well, let's just say a Spanish speaker give. So in Spanish it's masculine, as it is in Portuguese? It's not? Oh, no. What is it in Portuguese?
It's feminine.
Oh my God. Well, that's great. So we should totally study Portuguese versus Spanish then.
Yeah.
That would be interesting. So that would be really interesting because they're very close otherwise. So I'll tell you that the Spanish speakers would typically say that it was a strong bridge, that it was very bold, muy bravo, and all this stuff. You know, it was a good-looking bridge, you know, well-designed and everything. And then in the German speakers, their most common responses were things like graceful, beautiful, and you know, other things like that. And independently, you can confirm that those words are associated with particular gender ideas, right? I mean, intuitively it's true, but you can also go out and figure out that that's true. There was a norming study done with the same participants to show what gender entailments they have for the various words. So that is to say that, you know, and the same thing happens, by the way, with if you look at die Sonne, the sun, versus in Spanish, el sol. So again, there's a gender mismatch, and again, the sun is either, you know, happy and dancing, or really forceful and cruel. You know, so that also, you could object, has to do with the differences in climate between Spain and Germany, because it's independently been shown by anthropologists that the sun is usually conceived of as cruel once you get below a certain latitude. So if you're close to the equator, then you probably are more likely to think that the sun is cruel. If you're far away from the equator, then you think that the sun is a beautiful and wonderful thing. So you might want to ignore examples like that, but even if you check in other languages, you see the same effect. A comment from Thiago.
I'm just wondering, what influences what? In the following sense. It's something that happened to me when my cousin was really, really young.
Mm-hmm.
She was annoyed with the fact that in The Beauty and the Beast, the Disney classic,
Mm-hmm.
the teacup was a boy.
Ah.
Okay? Because she was fine with the clock being a guy.
Yeah.
No, because in Portuguese it's a masculine name.
Mm-hmm.
And
What is it in Portuguese?
O relógio.
Oh,
Okay? She was cool with the fact that the teapot, that can be chaleira in Portuguese, and also bule, which would be masculine, but chaleira is feminine, was the fact that Lear is a guy, because it's a masculine name in Portuguese, but she was pissed off by the fact that the cup, that in Portuguese is feminine, a xícara, was a boy.
Mm-hmm.
And if you ask schoolgirls and boys to draw, for example, a table or a chair or a cabinet, probably they will ascribe the gender information to their drawings you know. So they would draw that the cabinet is a man, but they would put lipstick on the table. So what I am wondering is, in fact, it doesn't go the other way around. You know, so you get the information on the gender of that object, and then you put sexual information over it. So as
That's-
to
Well, given this nature of the study, I would say that's exactly the right way to interpret it. Because, you know, we know that there's no reason other than a historical accident why bridge has one gender or the other. I mean, bridges are not really that gendered, objectively speaking. I'm speaking as an American here. It's clearly not gendered because there is no gender. But we can confirm that just on the basis that if you look across languages about which gender is chosen for a particular item, for most of them it's pretty random, other than history. Okay, so that part's random. But then, as you say, during our language acquisition, we are exposed to the fact that there is a gender that's associated grammatically with a particular noun. There's also a gender associated grammatically with things that we semantically categorize as masculine and feminine. If that second thing wasn't there, then there wouldn't be any effect at all. Note that the European gender system, European, Semitic, and a few other gender systems are special. Most gender systems actually aren't about gender, male, female at all. And those have not been tested at all. So I'll just put that out there. So, you know, European systems, Indo-European systems are peculiar in that way. But if we took Bantu language, which has something between 7 and 12 different gender classes, each of them have their own category associated with them. And then you might see some different kinds of entanglements. But masculine and feminine are very salient, and so once you get information from your language that says, aha, bridge in Spanish is supposed to be considered to be male, then that says, well, I should pay attention to the male properties of this thing and start to think of it that way. Okay?